The Bible. It's a collection of ancient texts, prophecies, poetry, history, and letters. It holds stories of kings, shepherds, wars, and miracles. But for many, the Bible remains an unopened mystery. Here at The Bible Explained, we're not just reading verses, we're exploring the cultural bedrock and the dramatic narrative woven through its 66 books. Hit that subscribe button and let the journey begin.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we stack up the sources, cut through the noise, and get right to the core of what you need to know. Today we are tackling a massive and really complex story, the destruction of the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is a narrative that's just woven so deeply into history and theology,
It absolutely is.
It's been used for millennia as this ultimate warning of divine judgment. But when you actually dig into the research, the articles, the archaeology, the science, it's just so much more complicated than a simple morality tale.
It really is. Our mission today is to move beyond that myth and explore, three distinct layers of complexity that challenge almost everything we think we know.
Okay, so what are they?
First, we're looking at the wildly shifting interpretations of why the cities were destroyed. Then, the really rigid geographical and chronological constraints that the ancient texts give us.
The when and the where.
Exactly. And finally, the fierce scientific debate over the archaeological sites and what actually happened. I mean, was it an earthquake or maybe something that fell from the sky?
And the starting point for all of this has to be the book of Genesis, right? Specifically, chapters 18 and 19.
That's our primary source. The story kicks off there with a divine revelation to Abraham. And the text, it immediately establishes the gravity of the situation, reporting an immense and extremely serious outcry rising against these cities.
That outcry sets the stage for what is, I think, one of the most incredible conversations in the entire text.
It really is. That encounter between God and Abraham, where judgment is on the table, it was clearly designed to be instructive. It wasn't just, a verdict. It was about establishing the very standard of justice required under the covenant.
And this is where it gets so interesting because Abraham, who is still just a man of faith at this point, he steps up and takes on this unbelievable role as an intercessor. He actually challenges God on the standard of justice.
He negotiates. It's an incredible piece of drama. Abraham literally haggles the required number of righteous people down. He starts at 50. And he eventually gets a divine promise that if just 10 righteous people could be found, the entire population would be spared. It's like the ultimate high-stakes poker game for a city's salvation.
That is just startling, isn't it? It shows the depth of divine grace that's available before the judgment even happens.
Right. But the narrative concludes that because those 10 couldn't be found, the judgment became a, quote, demonstrable necessity.
Which leads us directly into our first huge area of debate. What exactly was the sin that required this kind of destruction?
That is the central question, and the answer isn't static. It's not one thing. It shifts emphasis pretty dramatically depending on which ancient text you're reading. It suggests the story actually evolved to reflect the moral concerns of later generations.
Okay, so let's start with Genesis. What was the sin there?
So if we just look at the Genesis narrative in chapter 19, the immediate outward sin was a violation of hospitality.
Hospitality, not what most people think of.
Not at all. Lot's guests who are angelic visitors, they're vulnerable foreigners, and a mob gathers, demanding to know them. The Hebrew word is yada.
And that word yada, it's not ambiguous, is it?
Not really. Scholars overwhelmingly agree that here it implies sexual knowledge, and most likely a violent assault. So the sin was this attempted sexual violence and abuse against vulnerable guests. It was a capital crime against the sacred law of hospitality, what the Greeks called xenia.
So in Genesis, it's a terrifying act of mob violence, but it's really rooted in this total breakdown of community values.
Exactly. But then if we jump forward centuries to the prophetic tradition, the condemnation of Sodom just pivots entirely.
Away from sexual violence.
Completely. The prophet Ezekiel gives the clearest non-sexual critique. He frames the sin as a systemic ethical failure.
Okay, so what does Ezekiel say?
Ezekiel lays out 4 primary depravities, and none of them are sexual. He names pride and haughtiness. Affluence, or as the text says, fullness of bread, meaning they had far too much food. Then careless ease, or abundance of idleness. And then the critical failure. They did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy.
Wow. That changes everything. It's not just about a mob in the street. It's about a ruling class so wealthy and proud they literally had a food surplus while actively failing to help their neighbors.
Yes. It's the ultimate condemnation of unchecked affluence and just, indifference. It's a powerful social justice critique.
But that's not the end of the story.
Not at all. Because then you jump to the New Testament, and the focus shifts again back toward sexual behavior. Later texts, like the Epistle of Jude, use the cities as an example of judgment for, quote, having given themselves over to fornication and gone after strange flesh.
And that interpretation is the one that really took hold in the Western world, isn't it?
It is. It led directly to the historical coining of the term sodomy, which linked the catastrophe almost exclusively to unnatural desire or same-sex behavior.
So you have to hold these two big ideas in tension. Was it a collapse of communal ethics and socioeconomic justice, like Ezekiel says?
Which then violently manifested in that specific detestable act against Lot's guests in Genesis. Both readings are deeply rooted in the canonical sources, making the whole moral landscape incredibly complex.
So the moral landscape is complex, but the physical evidence, the thing that could ground this story in history, has to be the ruins themselves. How do you even start looking for a city that's so wrapped up in legend?
It is intensely difficult, and that's because we have to satisfy two non-negotiable constraints from the biblical texts. Otherwise, any site you find simply cannot be Sodom.
So what's the first one?
First is chronology, the timing. The destruction has to fall squarely within what's called the Patriarchal Age. That's the early or Middle Bronze Age. Archaeologists working with biblical scholars place this era somewhere between, say, 2166 and 1876 BCE. So we need a definitive destruction layer before 1750 BC.
That is a very, very precise time box for an excavation that deep in history.
It is. And the second constraint is geography. It's agreed the cities were near the Dead Sea. But critically, the prophet Ezekiel explicitly places Sodom to the south of Jerusalem. And Genesis mentions bitumen pits natural tar in the valley of Siddim, which is traditionally the southern basin of the Dead Sea.
Okay, south of Jerusalem and before 1750 BCE. That brings us to the modern archaeological debate, which seems to pit those two constraints against each other pretty fiercely.
It does. You have two main theories, and they point to destruction events that are literally hundreds of years apart.
So what's the first one, the traditional view?
The traditional, more established view is the southern Dead Sea theory. It centers on sites like Bab Edra and Numera. And this theory, it aligns perfectly with the textual constraints.
Bab Edra. Tell us a bit more about that site. What did it look like?
Well, Bab Edra is located southeast of the Dead Sea, so it supports Ezekiel's geography. And its destruction date, around 2350 BCE, places it comfortably in the early Bronze Age. It's a perfect match for the biblical chronology.
And it wasn't just some small village.
Far from it. Excavations show a prosperous, fortified city. We know Lot sat in the city gate of Sodom, and this site has major fortifications.
What about the affluence that Ezekiel talks about?
That's there too. They found evidence of highly managed irrigation systems supporting a rich diversity of crops: wheat, barley, grapes, olives. It all points to great wealth, which aligns with that critique of fullness of bread. They even found carbonized grapes, which suggests the city was destroyed in late spring or early summer.
So it's perfect on location and perfect on time. Why isn't this case closed? Why isn't this the definitive answer?
Because of the catastrophe constraint. Critics argue that the southern sites, they lack conclusive proof of a massive, sudden, fire-based conflagration, the kind of thing that would explain the utter ruin described in Genesis.
So there was a fire, but maybe not the fire.
Exactly. It might not have been the kind of overwhelming event that caused the total, widespread desolation the Bible describes.
Okay, so a partial match. Which brings us to the highly contested but scientifically revolutionary Northern Jordan Valley theory. This one is centered on a site called Tal el-Hammam.
Right. And this site, it fails the biblical constraints completely, but it offers a stunning explanation for the catastrophe itself.
What did they find there?
The findings at Tal el-Hammam, or Tik, are remarkable and, frankly, terrifying. The site shows evidence of extreme high-temperature devastation. Researchers found melted pottery, bubbled mud brick, where the clay literally exploded from the heat.
Wow.
And crucially, the presence of shocked quartz and tiny metal spherules. All of these things point to an extreme pressure event that must have happened high up in the atmosphere.
That sounds like a perfect match for fire and brimstone from heaven. What could have caused that?
The researchers attribute this to a massive cosmic airburst event.
An airburst.
Think of a fragment of an asteroid or a comet exploding miles above the surface. It's similar to the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908. The airburst over Tech is estimated to have had the energy of about 1,000 Hiroshima bombs.
1,000. That kind of force would just incinerate a city in seconds.
Instantly.
So wait, if Tal el-Hammam has this perfect physical evidence of fire and brimstone, but the dates are, 400 years too late, isn't that basically saying the science for the catastrophe exists, but the Bible got the history wrong?
That is the central dilemma. It's what splits the entire academic community. If you're a biblical minimalist, you might say the writers of Genesis recorded a real historical catastrophe, the airburst, but they just placed it into the story of Abraham to make a moral point.
But if you take the Bible's chronology seriously,
Then Tadim simply cannot be Sodom.
Well,
The contradictions are just too stark. Tal el-Hammam was destroyed between 1750 and 1650 BCE. That's 300 to 400 years too late for the patriarchal era.
then the geography.
It's northeast of Jerusalem. That directly contradicts Ezekiel's very explicit constraint that Sodom must be to the south. Critics argue that accepting Tad as Sodom requires you to accept gross inaccuracies in the biblical account on both location and timeline.
So we have two candidate sites. One fits the biblical time and place, but lacks clear evidence of the catastrophe. The other has incredible evidence of a cosmic catastrophe, but completely fails the biblical time and place.
That's the debate in a nutshell.
Okay, so regardless of which site, if either is correct, the story itself demands some kind of physical explanation for fire and brimstone. Let's look at how science tries to explain that, starting with a purely geological model.
The first major hypothesis is the geological catastrophe, or more specifically, the hydrothermal explosion hypothesis. This is rooted in the unique geology of the Dead Sea Rift Valley, which is highly seismic and just full of combustible materials.
What do you mean by that?
Think of the Dead Sea region as a kind of giant trap for sulfur and natural gas. When a major earthquake hits there, it's like popping the cap off a high-pressure geyser that's loaded with explosive gases and superheated water from deep inside the Earth's crust.
And what happens when that superheated liquid hits the air?
This is where the physics gets really intense. When that liquid, which can be hundreds of degrees Celsius, reaches atmospheric pressure, it instantly flashes to steam. And when it does that, its volume increases by up to 1,700 times.
To 1,700 times.
Yes. Imagine a teacup of liquid suddenly turning into a car-sized cloud of explosive, superheated steam. That expansion causes what are called thermobaric hydrothermal explosions.
That explains the blast and the pressure, but where does the fire come from?
That's the really elegant part of the theory. The intense friction from that high-velocity stream of steam and particles rubbing against solid surfaces, it's a process called triboelectricity, basically static electricity, creates the spark.
And that spark ignites all the gas.
It ignites the huge amounts of volatile gases and hydrocarbons being released from the ground at the same time, creating your fire and brimstone scenario. It explains why fire would appear high above the ground and then rain down.
Okay, so that's a localized geological fire. But the other theory, the cosmic airburst tied to Teshet, explains a much broader, longer-term catastrophe. And that, to me, is maybe the most shocking part of this whole thing.
Precisely. If we accept the evidence at Teshet, the physical destruction was, immense. But the ecological impact was truly generational. The airburst would have thrown up massive amounts of highly salty sediment and water from the Dead Sea, contaminating the entire valley floor.
It poisoned the earth.
It rendered the formerly fertile land completely infertile. And this ecological disaster forced the regional abandonment of all the cities in that area for approximately 600 years.
600 years.
Archaeologists call that period of desertion the Late Bronze Age gap.
6 centuries of environmental ruin after one single sudden catastrophe. I mean, that puts the idea of judgment into a whole new and very frightening ecological context.
Absolutely. The key takeaways here are that this story is an evolving theological touchstone. Its moral focus shifted over centuries, adapting from systemic socioeconomic justice and the prophets to sexual transgression in later texts.
And that evolving morality is tied directly to this intense historical search for a real catastrophe.
One that left a measurable physical mark on the landscape of the Dead Sea region.
So what does this all mean for you? Why should you care about a city that may or may not have been destroyed 4,000 years ago? Well, because the story of Sodom forces us to try and reconcile ancient texts, evolving morality, historical chronology, and modern science. It's the ultimate cold case where geology and theology intersect, and it shows us that morality and the environment are often deeply, deeply intertwined.
And here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. The biblical account mentions the cities being destroyed by the vengeance of eternal fire. But if the scientific evidence for a cosmic impact is correct, and that fire resulted in an ecological disaster that deposited so much salt it made the land uninhabitable for 6 centuries, what does that long-term generational ecological consequence tell you about the true scale of that ancient judgment? The environment itself carried this scar for 600 years.
The Bible isn't just a history book. It's a living, challenging text. As you reflect on what we covered today regarding this topic, consider how this new context changes your reading of the verses. If you appreciated this breakdown, sharing it with just one friend who struggles with understanding the Bible is the best way you can support the channel. Subscribe for more, click here for your next explanation, and never stop seeking clarity. Until next time.